He woke up in a small bed that smelled like soap and boiled rice, his suit coat damp and his expensive shoes kicked off in a corner. How did the richest man in the city end up on a thin mattress in a maid's room? Anna sat on the floor by the door, hands folded on her knees, heart loud in her throat, praying he would be gentle when he opened his eyes. The first thing Robert Gray saw was the ceiling fan turning slow and the late gray light of the city sliding across a cracked plaster wall. For a long second, he did not know where he was. The next thing he heard was a whisper of a name. "Sir?" Small and careful. A million things were supposed to happen differently for Robert Gray. He had taught himself to expect the world to bend for him. The best seats, the quickest drivers, the quiet that comes when a room knows not to bother a man who made his fortune young. But this morning, the room smelled of laundry and lemon, and a faint cologne from someone who had not earned the right to smell like money. He felt the fabric of his suit cling to his skin, the taste of cheap wine in the back of his mouth, and a soft, terrible shame that comes from waking up where you do not belong. Anna saw his face go from confusion to shame, and she shrank, not because she feared his money, but because she feared what the world would say about hers. She had worked for years in glass-fronted buildings and private houses, keeping her head low so the rich would not notice how much she saw. A single mistake, she knew, could be turned into a headline, a joke, a ruin. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked, voice trying to be steady. Robert blinked. The city sound around them was waking up. A hawker calling for bread, the rumble of a bus. He remembered slurred laughter, then a bright room full of white shirts and sparkling glasses. He remembered a hand on his shoulder, his own hand, steadying himself, and then a blur. He remembered stepping out into the rain and thinking the night would wash him clean. He did not remember getting into this flat. He did not remember Anna. "Oh my God," Anna said, and the words were a soft prayer and a curse. She had put a blanket over him in the night and tied his tie loosely to keep him warm. She had set his cufflinks on the small table and slid his watch under a pillow because, if theft happens, at least the thief would have to work for it. She had not wanted trouble, but trouble finds the loud in every quiet room. When he sat up and saw the tiny room, the picture on the cheap dresser, the two plastic chairs outside the window, his hands trembled. He had always been the kind of man whose hands did not tremble. He had learned to steady them in boardrooms, at charity galas, at hospitals for ribbon cuttings. Now they shook because he did not own the moment, because the world had pressed him into someone else's story for a few hours, and people would not know how to read the ending. "How did I—" he began. He stopped. A voice on the radio downstairs, a neighbor's television. Something in the air told him the city was already talking. Anna looked at him, eyes open and honest. "You were outside," she said. You looked like you were lost. I thought you were hurt." Robert saw there was no accusation in her tone. There was only the tired, careful human kindness of someone who knew harm lurks in loud things. He felt suddenly a raw gratitude and an awful culpability. He had been the kind of man who assumed others would simply step aside for him. He had never learned how to accept someone's small mercy. Now he wanted it more than anything. They stepped into a strange morning together. By noon, the city's cheap cameras and louder tongues had done their work. A photograph from a neighbor's window, a man in a suit crossing a dim hallway toward a tiny door, leaked to a tabloid. The headline did its job. "Billionaire found in Maid's bed." The article stretched like acid over rooftops. People called, texted, whispered. The board of Robert's company met in a glass tower and measured the damage in stock ticks and ledgers. His wife packed a small bag and left a note he could not make himself read. His secretary called and left 10 messages that said the same thing. "We need you now." His board called and used the word reputation as if it were a blade. They wanted a statement, a distance, a denial. Robert had created a kingdom of careful appearances. Now that kingdom shook like a table with one crooked leg. He could have lied. He could have hired lawyers and said the photograph was doctored, that the whole thing was a trap. He could have offended Anna with a cold, corporate version of kindness, a check and an apology letter. Many men had done that before, and the world kept going. But Anna was not a story he wanted to edit. She was a person who had rinsed his suit with her own hands because she feared his cold would bring worse. She had tucked a hand towel under his chin because his face had turned pale in her small house. He felt his chest split open in a way a man of business rarely admits to. He felt small and genuine and scared. When he walked into her building an hour later, he did so with the humility of a man who had realized, in a single breath, how much of his life had been soft and hollow. Anna met him on the landing. She wore a plain dress and rubber slippers. She had hung a line of clean shirts in the narrow corridor. Her hair was tied back with an elastic. You might have called her ordinary. Robert did not see ordinary. He saw work like prayer. "Sir," she said. She did not say Mr. Gray. She did not ask for money. She did not hold out a hand for his apology. She only looked at him with a patience that came from carrying 10 years of mornings on her shoulders. He wanted to hand her a pen and tell the world to rewrite itself so she would not have to answer to slurs and pages. Instead, he asked a simple question that had never quite come up in board meetings. Will you be all right?" She laughed, a sound that was half vocabulary and half years spent learning how to breathe. "I will be," she said. "But, sir, you should go. Your people are looking for you." He saw the door of her life in a way that made his throat tighten. It was small, but it had a curtain, strips of cloth that kept the rain from the mattress. There was a single lamp that burned late to dry the shirts. He had spent billions on things he no longer remembered. Her single lamp was bright enough to make him see. The crisis that followed was not the tabloids. The crisis was the way his company began to fracture without him. The board, smelling weakness, pushed for control. Investors murmured. The man who had built his life on certainty now watched his empire wobble because of a mistake he could not scrub with lawyers. There was also a quieter crisis. A group of workers in one of his factories started an online petition. They sent pictures of broken machines, of plain rooms where safety was optional because cost mattered more than life. A photograph of an injured man, a worker who had lost a day of wages because of a careless cut that would have been fixed with decent equipment, found its way into Robert's email. He saw the tremor of fear in that man's eyes, the same tremor he had felt waking on the thin mattress. At the center of all of it was Anna. Rumors swirled that she had been his lover or his conspirator. People made up stories because the truth was duller. She had taken pity on a drunk stranger because she thought the world deserved better than cruelty. But the headlines had teeth, and teeth bite hard. Robert found himself thinking of the small decisions that had built his life. The contracts he had signed, the factories he had allowed to cut corners, the men he had met in the back rooms and promised the moon. He had been taught to think in scales and profits, and some small part of him had never learned how to feel the hurt a worker does when their hand is cut, or when their child is sick, and there is no money for medicine. He began to visit the places his headlines had never asked him to see. At first it was simple. He drove himself in a quiet car and walked down a narrow street to a small clinic where Anna took her little brother's temperature every Sunday. The doctor there greeted him like a man from a different country, with suspicion and a clipboard. Robert presented himself as a man who had nothing to hide because, in truth, he had nothing to hide except a complicated past and a desire to make right what felt wrong. He met the brother, a thin boy with a cough and a laugh like a bell. Robert saw how the boy's teeth were not quite straight, how a missing vaccine could change a child's future. The boy talked about the TV shows he liked and the birds on the roof. Robert felt an old, unfamiliar thing. His chest opened like a window and the light came in. Word of his visits spread. Some said he was doing PR. Some said he was buying forgiveness. He did not know which was true, even as he handed over money for the boy's tests. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of an action that landed not on balance sheets but on small, pulsing lives. He began to realize that his empire had a shadow he had not walked into for a long time. Anna kept her distance. She had no appetite for being the puppet in anyone's story. She accepted his help for her brother because a mother would accept bread for a hungry child. But she resisted being pulled into his world of cameras and slick men with smiles like knives. She did not want to be the maid who saved the billionaire or the woman who took his money. She wanted to be allowed to live in her life without being a cautionary tale. This is where the story could have split into many simple things. Robert could have offered a check and gone back to a life arranged by handlers. Anna could have taken it and walked away. But humans are complicated. They are not actors in headlines. They are people who can surprise even themselves. One evening, after the headline fever cooled but the harm remained, Anna invited Robert to sit at her kitchen table. There was a pot of stew and 2 small bowls. The radio hummed low. They ate with spoons that did not match. Robert listened. It is easy to listen when you have less to guard. She told him the story of how she came to the city. She told him about her mother who worked other people's farms and died with 2 coins in her pocket, about the small house she shared with her brother, about the way people in the buildings above looked down and seldom saw. She told him about nights when the rent was due and there was no work, and mornings when she went out in a clean dress and pretended that the day would be kind. Robert listened like a man learning to read a new language. He had never been asked to know such details. His world had been numbers and strategy, not small human failure. He felt shame for the factories that had cut a corner and for the contracts that had put profits above people. He felt anger at his own blindness. "You think money fixes everything," Anna said once, not angry but tired. "But it only fixes things when people who have it remember to use it for the right reasons." He thought of the boardroom where men had told him to deny and to spin. He thought of the lawyers who said a statement and a fine would clear a scandal. He thought of the man with the cut hand whose image had come into his inbox. He wanted to stand at the glass windows of his towers and throw down the old ways and promise the city a new kind of work. So he started small and clumsy in a world that expected him to be steel-bound and quick. He called a meeting with his board and told them he would audit safety practices in all factories. The response was polite on the surface and savage beneath. "This is a distraction," said a man who counted his income in years rather than in nights. "We cannot fix everything overnight." Robert realized the board would not move fast. Money begets caution, and caution is the mother of slow promises. He resigned his seat in the hurry that followed and took with him a small fortune he could move without permission. Reporters called it a meltdown. Friends called it madness. To many people, it looked like a man chasing redemption. To Robert, it felt like a slow wearing away of an old armor. He became visible in places he had never wanted to be seen. At a factory floor with grease under his nails, at a clinic handing out forms, in a meeting with union leaders learning that he had been wrong. He was humbled in ways that had no board minutes. Anna watched all this with a cautious heart. She had seen men transform before. A man with money will promise anything to get the headlines off his chest. But Robert stayed. He did not walk away with press releases. He stayed and listened to where the pain had been left. He used his own money to buy safer machines, to pay for education programs, to fund the little clinic that had fixed her brother's cough. He started a foundation that trained workers to speak up. He hired managers who had lived in the neighborhoods he had once ignored. People called it an act of penance. People called it smart PR. Some people called Anna a saint for letting him near. But saints do not need the world's applause. Anna needed honesty. The thing about change is that it does not come without cost. As he fought the slow war against the gears of his old world, Robert lost friends. He lost deals. He lost the smooth lines of power. His wife wanted her life back the way it had been and could not live with the public unraveling. He signed what he had to sign and let the house at the river go. Men who had eaten at his table refused to meet him, but there was something in him that felt more alive than any quarterly report. People started to notice. The workers he visited began to speak up, not because he told them to, but because they saw an ear that listened. Small victories happened. A life saved by a new safety guard, a child vaccinated, a woman who no longer had to double shift to pay rent. It was slow, messy work. Numbers moved in ways that were not dramatic enough for headlines, but the changes were real, and for Robert, that felt like breathing. Then came the twist that no one expected, least of all Robert. One rain-slick morning, as Robert walked the low neighborhood that had become his refuge, a woman from a cleaning agency approached him. Her name was Mabel. She had sharp eyes and a habit of folding her hands like she was holding tight to more than herself. "You used to own the building where my father worked," she said quietly. "He remembers the time your grandfather bulldozed those houses. They told us thank you sometimes, but mostly they left people without roofs. My father lost his small shop when the land changed hands. He died without seeing much change." Robert paused. The city had layers like an onion, each making your eyes water if you moved too fast. "I know," he said before he thought, and his voice felt small. Mabel reached into her bag and pulled out a faded photograph. In it, a child with a gap-toothed grin stood beside a little girl holding a doll. Robert looked at the girl. She looked like a dream of a life he could not remember, and at the same time felt like a memory from his bones. "Your name used to come up in the mouths of families who lost their shops," she said. "They said the Greys built a city, but left holes. Who else could fix them?" He thought of Anna and her brother and the boy at the clinic. He thought of the man with the cut hand. He thought of his own waking in a stranger's bed and the way a single night had thrown him into a new life. The photograph was a pull on something deeper than regret. It was a choice. When he went to Anna that day, he did not bring a press team. He brought plans in his briefcase and the humility to ask how to help properly. She looked at him as if he were both foolish and brave. "Some things you can pay for," she said. "Other things need time and trust." He began to trust her not because she had changed him in a movie-like second, but because she refused to let him play at guilt. She told him when his plans were half-baked, when his words sounded like a press release, when his promises needed more than money. She taught him to listen without thinking of the next headline. She taught him the quiet art of showing up day after day. The relationship between them did not bloom overnight like a headline suggests. It was crooked and real. There were days when he wanted to retreat into the old towers of his life, and days when she wanted to run away from the attention his name drew. But they shared small things. A cup of tea at dawn, a laugh at a joke about the city's traffic, a quiet walk where he learned the names of streets that had never appeared on his suite's maps. The world still talked. They made caricatures of him and of her. The tabloids sold pages with pictures of him and her walking down a street and called it scandal or romance, depending on the day. Men called him weak for listening. Women told her she could do better. But the work they did together was not for papers. It was for people with coughs and torn shoes and bills that came like hurricanes. Before the end, there had to be a reveal that would test everything. One late night, a file found its way into Robert's desk. A list of contractors who had supplied cheap parts to his factories. One name kept appearing. A shadow company run by a man who had once been a trusted partner. Robert called the man and asked him why. The man laughed and said, "We all make choices." Robert realized the truth had a shape that hurt. Some of his early decisions, made under pressure and greed and a hunger to expand, had allowed people to profit from cutting corners. That man did not just make choices. He had built a web that fed off other people's safety. The reveal was not that he had been fooled. The reveal was that his success had, in places, been fed by cruelty. Anna had worked in one of those factories years ago after her mother died. She had been dismissed when she protested unsafe equipment. She never told him because she had kept her dignity and her work separate from his name. But once the file came out, once the machines were audited, the truth spilled. Anna's sister sent an old letter she had kept, and it became a small paper trail that led back to those factories. The city felt like an old wound being cleaned. The big twist was this. The man who had been Robert's mentor, the one who guided him through the first deals and showed him the path to power, had been the architect of the cheap part scheme. He had taught Robert that money was a number and men were instruments. Robert had not known everything. He had not wanted to. Now, he had to face his mentor and the consequences. It broke him to see people he once trusted named in the same breath as the accident victims. It broke him more to see Anna's face when she read the names. He thought he would have to choose to protect himself, his old friends, his life of prestige. Instead, he chose differently. He called a press conference not to deny, but to confess. He told the city what he had learned and what he intended to do. He named those contractors. He promised to make reparations. He promised to fund the retraining of workers and to transform factory safety. He offered public apologies to families he had never met. Many people thought him foolish. His stock took a hit. The tower of his empire visibly lost a few floors. But something else happened. The men whose lives were touched by the changes began to speak. The doctor at the clinic smiled when a woman came in with her vaccinated child and said, "Your man made this happen." The worker who had lost a day's wage received back pay. A small business in a neighborhood that had been bulldozed before got a fund to rebuild a market. The change was messy but true. For Anna, the confessions were not enough without real deeds. He knew this. He worked in the small print, in the daily letters, in the slow matching of need to help. He learned how to be patient with people who had been burned before. He learned to accept that money could not buy forgiveness, but could be a tool for repair. Before the end of our story, the world gave both of them a gift and a test. A national awards committee nominated Robert for a prize, a recognition for corporate social responsibility. Men who had once called him weak oddly applauded. Anna refused to attend the ceremony at first. She said she did not want to be paraded as a symbol. Robert insisted. He asked her to come and to sit beside him. When her name was called as the one who had inspired the reforms at the root of the change, she stood and the room quieted. Her voice was strong and clear. She spoke not of him alone, but of the many who had to work without safety and of the neighbors who waited for small kindnesses. She said what she had always said at the kitchen table, that money must be used where it hurts. After the applause and the cameras, they walked home in the rain. Under a single umbrella, they went slowly. The city lights reflected in puddles and looked for once like small promises. He reached for her hand. She did not pull away. The end came not as a perfect cure, but as a hard-won honesty. Robert did not become a new man overnight. He kept making mistakes. He had moments of weakness and days when the old world called him with the charm of easy deals. Anna had days when the cameras made her skin crawl, but they had built a life together that started with an embarrassing night and grew into a story of repair. On the last page of this long morning, Robert and Anna sat in a small kitchen and ate breakfast that was not photographed. A boy laughed outside on the stairs. A neighbor offered spices. Anna's brother hummed a tune. Robert listened. He had been a man who once believed power was keeping things at a safe distance. Now he knew power could mean coming close and staying. If there is a lesson, it is not the one the tabloids sell. It is not that a man must fall from grace to rise with grace. It is that we all carry a small room inside us where things can be changed by a single act of kindness, of courage, of truth. The billionaire waking in a maid's bed was not the punchline. The punchline was that the waking changed the man and, in small ways, the city. So tell me, which part of this story touched you most? Was it his choice to confess, her quiet strength, or the way the city slowly healed? Leave your answers in the comments. If you want more deep, emotional stories like this one, subscribe to Emotional Stories and click the bell so you never miss a moment.